There are friendships that the world witnesses from a distance, captured in photographs, discussed in headlines, and romanticized by strangers who never truly understood what lay beneath the surface. And then there are friendships so deep, so quietly powerful, that even the two people living inside them struggle to find the right words to describe what they meant to each other. The bond between Elton John and Princess Diana was exactly that kind of friendship. It was not a partnership built on publicity or mutual benefit. It was something far rarer and far more fragile. It was a connection forged between two extraordinarily famous people who were, at their cores, profoundly lonely. And for decades, the full truth of that friendship, its warmth, its ruptures, its grief, and its legacy, has never been completely told. Now, pieced together from Elton's own autobiography, his interviews across the years, and the accounts of people who were present for the moments that mattered most, the real story can finally be understood. It is a story about laughter in gilded rooms, about the courage it takes to be honest in a world that rewards performance, about a falling out driven by pride, and about a reconciliation that came just weeks before it was too late. Most of all, it is a story about what it means to lose someone before you have finished loving them. To understand why Elton John and Princess Diana found each other so instantly and so completely, you have to first understand the worlds they each inhabited and how isolating those worlds truly were. By the early 1980s, Elton John had already conquered the music industry in a way that very few artists ever do. His concerts were theatrical spectacles. His costumes were legendary. His records sold in the tens of millions. He had performed on every major stage on earth, dined with heads of state, and been embraced by the kind of celebrity culture that turns human beings into symbols. Yet behind all of that color and noise, Elton was navigating a deeply complicated private life. His sexuality, in an era when homophobia was socially acceptable and publicly expressed, meant that he was always performing a version of himself for the world rather than simply being himself. He carried the exhausting weight of a public persona that was never quite the whole truth. Diana Spencer, meanwhile, was about to step into one of the most scrutinized roles in modern history. In 1981, she was a young nursery school assistant, warm and instinctively empathetic, who was preparing to marry the heir to the British throne. The fairy tale framing of her engagement to Prince Charles delighted the world. But inside the palace walls, the reality was far more complicated. Diana was entering an institution defined by rigid protocol, emotional restraint, and centuries of tradition that left very little room for a person who led with her heart. She was stepping not just into a marriage, but into a performance that would be expected of her for the rest of her life. When the two of them first met at a party celebrating Prince Andrew's 21st birthday at Windsor Castle, something clicked almost immediately. Elton was seated at the piano, performing for the glittering crowd of aristocrats and dignitaries, and feeling, by his own admission, somewhat out of place among the formality of it all. Then Diana walked in, and the atmosphere shifted. She had an effortless quality that Elton recognized at once, a way of making every person in a room feel as though they were the most important one there. They began talking, and within minutes the conversation felt easy and real in a way that contrasted sharply with the stiffness of the event around them. They ended up doing an impromptu Charleston together in the middle of the ballroom, laughing freely, drawing glances from the other guests, including a quietly amused Queen Elizabeth herself. It was, by all accounts, a meeting of kindred spirits. Both of them were, in their own ways, outsiders in the rooms they were expected to inhabit. Both were performing versions of themselves for audiences who expected certain things from them. And both, beneath the performance, were searching for spaces where they could simply be honest. In each other, they found that space, and it became one of the most important relationships either of them would ever have. Throughout the 1980s and into the early 1990s, the friendship between Elton and Diana deepened in ways that rarely made it into the press, precisely because the most meaningful parts of it happened away from cameras. They appeared together at charity galas and public events, and those photographs circulated widely. But the friendship that mattered was the one conducted in private conversations, in phone calls, in quiet dinners where the two of them could speak, without filters. Elton has described Diana as one of the most genuinely compassionate people he ever knew. She had a quality that went far beyond the charm she projected publicly. She listened. She remembered details. She followed up. When she knew that a friend was struggling, she showed up, not with grand gestures, but with her actual presence and her full attention. For someone who lived in Elton's world, where almost every interaction carried some element of professional calculation, that quality was extraordinary and deeply refreshing. Diana, for her part, found in Elton a friendship without expectation. He was not a palace official with an agenda. He was not a journalist looking for a story. He was not a courtier invested in managing her image. He was simply a person who knew what it felt like to be famous and lonely at the same time, who understood the particular isolation of living inside a life that the whole world thinks it understands, but actually does not. When her marriage to Prince Charles deteriorated through the mid-1980s, and the newspapers began filling with reports of distance and unhappiness inside Kensington Palace, it was to friends like Elton that Diana turned for steadiness. Their shared commitment to AIDS awareness became one of the most visible expressions of their friendship's values. At a time when the disease was being discussed in whispers and associated with shame, both of them chose to stand publicly and visibly against that stigma. Diana's decision to visit AIDS patients in hospitals, to shake their hands and embrace them without the protective gloves that fear and prejudice might have suggested, was one of the bravest public acts of her era. Elton watched her do it and understood immediately what it cost her within the institution she represented. The palace did not encourage such gestures. The establishment preferred distance. But Diana, characteristically, chose humanity over protocol, and Elton loved her for it. He has spoken about the way her humor balanced all of that earnestness. Diana was funny, genuinely and irreverently funny, in a way that surprised people who only knew her from formal photographs. She loved to tease, to gossip, to dissolve the pomposity of the world around her with a well-timed joke. Elton, whose own humor has always been sharp and self-deprecating, found her comedy irresistible. There were evenings together by various accounts that dissolved into pure laughter, the kind that leaves two people breathless and slightly ashamed of themselves. That combination of deep empathy and genuine mischief was, in Elton's telling, the essence of who Diana really was. But the friendship was also tested by the pressures bearing down on both of them. Diana's private struggles during these years were significant. She was dealing with the collapse of her marriage, the relentless scrutiny of the press, and the emotional toll of living inside an institution that was not designed to support her well-being. Elton, during the same period, was fighting his own battles with addiction, a dependency on drugs and alcohol that had been building for years, and that he would eventually have to confront head-on. Both of them were carrying more than the world could see. And both, in their best moments together, helped the other carry it a little more lightly. By the mid-1990s, the friendship had developed the kind of complexity that comes with long relationships between strong personalities. They had moved beyond the initial enchantment of discovering each other and into the more textured territory of genuine intimacy, which means they had also developed the capacity to genuinely hurt each other. The falling out, when it came, arrived through a charity project that meant a great deal to Elton. He was producing a photography book featuring images of rock and roll culture, with all proceeds designated for AIDS research. The book was a significant undertaking, and he had asked Diana to write the foreword. She had agreed. For Elton, her participation was more than a practical contribution. It was a statement of values, a declaration from one of the most recognizable people in the world that this cause mattered. Then came the withdrawal. A formal letter arrived from Diana's office, measured and polite in its language, explaining that she would not be able to participate after all. The reason, as Elton came to understand it, was pressure from within royal circles, discomfort about a member of the royal family lending her name to a publication that contained certain photographs deemed inappropriate by palace standards. The specifics of the objection were almost beside the point for Elton. What stung was the sudden distance, the formality where there had been friendship, the sense that the institution had reached in and pulled her away. He expressed his disappointment to her directly, which was entirely consistent with the honest nature of their friendship. But the timing was delicate, and Diana was carrying an enormous personal burden of her own. Her divorce from Prince Charles was finalized in August of 1996, a public and painful conclusion to a marriage that the whole world had been watching disintegrate for years. With the divorce came the removal of her title and a significant shift in her official status. She was navigating one of the most disorienting periods of her life, and the pressures on her from every direction were immense. Her response to Elton's message was cold in a way that was unlike her. He described it as curt, a sharp departure from the warmth that had always characterized their communication. And rather than reaching back across that distance, both of them retreated into their respective pride. Elton, hurt and feeling abandoned by someone he had trusted completely, did not pick up the phone. Diana, overwhelmed, and perhaps feeling judged in a moment of vulnerability, did not reach out either. And so the silence settled between them, like weather. For almost a year, they did not speak. Elton has been candid about how much that year cost him. Not in any practical sense, but emotionally, in the way that unresolved conflict with someone you genuinely love tends to sit heavily on everything else. He knew, even at the time, that the rupture was more about circumstance and exhaustion than any fundamental incompatibility between them. He knew she was struggling. He knew the palace advisors had likely played a role. But pride, as he has acknowledged, is a powerful silencer. And neither of them, in that particular season of their lives, was able to be the first one to speak. The event that brought them back to each other was a tragedy. On the 15th of July, 1997, the fashion designer Gianni Versace was murdered outside his Miami Beach home. The news devastated the worlds of fashion, music, and entertainment simultaneously. For both Elton and Diana, it was an acutely personal loss. Versace had been a genuine friend to both of them, one of those rare individuals whose warmth and creativity connected people across very different worlds. At Versace's funeral in Milan, Elton was seated among the mourners, visibly grieving. He and Diana had not spoken in months. There was no guarantee, given the circumstances of their silence, that she would approach him at all. But Diana was, at her core, someone who allowed her instincts toward connection to override the calculations of pride. She walked across the room to where he was sitting, took his hand, and spoke simply and directly. She apologized for the falling out and suggested that they let it go and return to being friends. The relief in that moment must have been profound. Elton has described it as deeply moving, the kind of reconciliation that restores something you had not fully realized you were missing until it was suddenly present again. And in the way that was quintessentially Diana, the emotional weight of the moment was quickly punctured by humor. Her first instinct, having said what needed to be said, was apparently to express a craving for a polo mint, which broke the solemnity entirely and sent them both into laughter. It was, as a way to restart a friendship, perfect. They made plans to meet again. There were conversations to catch up on, months of life that each of them had lived without the other to share it with. The reconciliation felt, by Elton's account, like the beginning of a new chapter rather than simply a return to the old one. They were both different people than they had been before the silence, and perhaps that meant the friendship ahead of them would have a slightly different quality than the one behind them. But the chapter never got to begin. 6 weeks after that moment in Milan, Princess Diana was killed in a car crash in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris. She was 36 years old. Elton John learned of Diana's death in the early hours of August 31st, 1997, woken by the sound of a fax arriving at his home. The message expressed condolences. He turned on the television and understood immediately the scale of what had happened, not just to him personally, but to the world. The grief was complicated by the nearness of the reconciliation. They had just found their way back to each other. The friendship had just been restored. And now it was gone before either of them had had the chance to fully inhabit what it might have become. That particular kind of loss, the loss of something that was just beginning to be rebuilt, carries its own specific weight. When Spencer family asked Elton to perform at Diana's funeral, he accepted without hesitation. Working with his longtime lyricist Bernie Taupin, he reworked a song he had originally written in 1973, Candle in the Wind, which had been composed as a tribute to Marilyn Monroe. The new version was reimagined as a farewell to Diana, opening with words that named her specifically and placed her in the landscape of England she had come to represent for so many people around the world. On the 6th of September, 1997, Elton performed the song inside Westminster Abbey before the coffin of his friend, in front of the watching world. He has described the experience as unlike anything else in his career. He was not performing. He was grieving, and the song was the form that grief took in that moment. Every note was aimed at one person who could no longer hear it, and the millions watching understood intuitively that they were witnessing something that was not a concert, but a private farewell that happened to be public. The single release of that performance became the best-selling record in history at the time, with over 33 million copies sold. But Elton has consistently expressed discomfort with that commercial fact. The song was not meant to be a hit. It was not something he could celebrate or feel proud of in the conventional sense. Every time someone mentioned the numbers, he felt a kind of quiet resistance, because to him the song was not a piece of music. It was a scar. In the years that followed Diana's death, Elton John continued to carry her memory in both public and private ways. He has spoken about her in interviews with a consistency and tenderness that suggests the friendship never stopped being present to him, even after she was gone. He has spoken of his responsibility toward her sons, Harry and William, as something